Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I think our conversation this week sort of builds off of what we talked about last week in certain ways. Last week we were talking about the ways in which, just by Torah law, there's like some amount of ambiguity about what's actually forbidden. This came up specifically with the question of unmarried women going to mikveh, where we talked about how, if you look just in the Torah, it's not so clear. Even if you look in the Talmud, it's not so clear. Yes, you're not, a man's not supposed to sleep with a girl who isn't married, but is there really a prohibition? Is it a rabbinic prohibition, or is it like really a Torah level prohibition? And so that's what we talked about last week. This week, there's sort of another different, but in some ways similar kind of rabbinic issue on the laws from the Torah, which is the law of Yichud, the prohibition against being secluded with someone of the opposite gender who is not married to you and is not, an immediate relative of yours. So like parents, sister, and so forth, fine. But beyond that, it becomes complicated. For example, actually, adoption's very complicated in the far right Orthodox world because of issues of Yichud, of whether, if a child is adopted once they, reach an age of maturity, is there a problem with them being alone with an adopted mother, right? Things like that, which for most of us are like, of course not, that's his mother. But these questions of Yichud really do become prominent in a lot of different areas of being alone with, again, who is not a immediate relative. Sort of the same people when we talk about the prohibitions on touch. You can hug a man can hug his mom or sister or obviously like daughter, but beyond that it becomes more complicated. So it's the same kind of thing with Yichud. Those same people who there's prohibitions against touching, at least in a romantic, or potentially romantic way. There's prohibitions about being secluded with them. Yichud, I think, comes up in many ways, in many contexts in this episode. The one that sort of interested me particularly was the Nazi in the car with the woman, I forget her name. So that, that's one where, often there's conversation about, people are more lenient often when it comes to things like being alone in a car because there's windows and everyone can see. And yet we saw from this episode, I don't know, maybe it's more complicated in a car. You're very close to someone. There's sort of a ease of, of touching, let's say, which access. Might, what?
Access. Like you can.
Yeah, ease of access, right? And I mean, potentially even there's a difference between sitting in the front versus the back seat of a car, right? That sort of establishes a difference. So, there's that scene. There's also the Avner and Yifat scene where, again, Yifat doesn't think about this as being a problem. It's, I'm having this guy over to my house to have cookies, but at the same time, they're alone in her house with no one else there. That's a problem. And it becomes a problem because he, let's say makes an advance, or certainly seems to make an advance. And then we finish with Amir and Yifat and sort of this question of, is he going to sleep over? He sort of is saying that he's suddenly has a crush on her. Nazi was often alone with Yifat. So they do not seem to be very careful about the laws of Yichud at all, ever, in this show. Generally, though, we'll note that one of the rules when it comes to Yichud is that it's, if there's a decent likelihood of someone coming in, either you leave the door open or you leave the door certainly unlocked, all these kinds of things, and so I think Yifat's in her apartment, there's at least an argument to make that Yichud might not have been a problem because her roommates were so frequently coming in and out that, there wasn't real privacy. In her house out in the mountains, like it's a different story. No one else is coming in. So, Rabbi Shatzli.
No, I think that's a major leniency. Like, I think that, just assuming that someone might come in the house, like, I mean,
well, certainly you should leave your apartment door open and things like that, Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm not saying it's great, but I'm saying there's at least, even if I would say, okay, they're not doing, they're not following the laws of Yichud, there's like some consciousness of that.
Yeah.
But in this episode, we see a few instances in which, you really have a man and a woman secluded in a place where there's no one's going to interrupt if anything were to happen. There's sort of very much a sense of being alone, right? Even if someone, came after the other, like there's no one around.
Amir, when Amir's with Yifat, he actually says, he's looking at the situation differently now. Up to now, he had a different view, perhaps because he was surrounded by other people, and now he's thinking differently of Yifat.
Right, which you would expect then she would not offer for him to sleep over, right?
Right, and she's confused.
All of a sudden, Rabbi Pernick and I were talking about this last night. Like, all of a sudden in this episode, he loves her. We go from them having Shabbat dinner together every week for the past 9 episodes, and now all of a sudden he's in love with her. Okay, fine, whatever. Might not have been the best writing ever, but okay. But the fact that he says that to her, right, that seems to be the opposite of an invitation to have him sleep over, especially if you're worried about the laws of Yichud, right? It's very different to have a friend, well, it's not very different halachically. It's very different in your mind to have a person stay over for whom you don't have romantic feelings for, or don't assume they have romantic feelings for you. It's very different if the person says to you, to your face, I have feelings for you. Oh, sure. Why don't you sleep over? Like that seems to be kind of completely going against the law.
But she's so confused because she's very lonely.
Right.
She wants company, but again, she doesn't want to break the rules,
Yeah, Karen just said he visited Yifat and saw her in a different way. Yes, you and Rabbi Pernick can have a conversation about that. Sure, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It's like he saw her in a different context, away from friends, away from Jerusalem. She's out in the mountains.
Wait a minute. Wait a second.
Yeah.
You're going to argue with me, Rabbi S?
She disagrees. I'm totally on your side, Karen. But yeah.
Okay.
Me too. I'm with Karen.
We can talk about it another time. I don't think that's how things work, but we can talk about it another time. I don't think that you all of a sudden visit someone 15 minutes away from where you live and all of a sudden you're in love with them. I don't think that's how it works.
First of all, he's divorced. He's into what next to do, and then nobody said hello to me, but they said hello to you, and it's the color of the kippah, whatever's going on.
Yeah.
Then he and the one this is nameless, talked about Yifat being in a way, and she's really, somebody to think about. In other words, okay, you know what, I'm not going to have an argument with you.
No. First of all, I love when you have arguments with me, but I agree with that point. I agree that there is something about her that he is interested in from before, that he finds her to be someone who brings their friends together, who has this overwhelming kindness, all these
things. Yeah, all that.
Yeah, she cooks, great. Yeah, exactly.
Natty was in the way before. Natty was in the way. Natty's his buddy. And she knows that you felt like Natty.
Okay, all right, you're all convincing, sure.
I think there's also an element, in Jerusalem, you're right. Amir is a guy who was married and had a home. I mean, it was an apartment, but he had a home as it were. And now he's hanging out in this sort of very friends context with a bunch of people all together. And suddenly, right, he sees her and she has a home. She has literally a house out in the mountains. Suddenly, it's just things appear differently, and I think it does change the way he sees her. Suddenly, it's he hadn't even thought about that before. He was kind of interested in Re'ud and whatever, and now it's oh, look at it. It's sort of sees her in the way. Okay, Renee's been raising her hand for a while, as has my father just raised. But Renee,
But I think I was going to ask you when you were talking back whether or not the situation with her and the married guy also constituted Yichud. breaking Yichud, but you already talked about that.
Yes. Okay. Certainly. Yeah. So Yichud.
I think like Karen, I think he saw her in a different light now. And, he took her out of the context. She's in a different place. I think he probably had feelings for her prior to that too. But I think it was more, it was a different level. It was under different levels.
I don't know. I think she has the headband on. She's in the mountains.
It doesn't matter.
I think it matters. Or the Cuba.
It was the food. Food is also food. The food was actually a big convincing point too, I think.
Okay, we're gonna call on the other Rabbi Pernick, and because he's probably not going to talk about headbands. So okay.
Well, I was going to talk about one thing, but I'm going to end up with another one. So my mom had a cookbook that some of the people here might know, and it was called the Settlements Cookbook, right? And the at the beginning of it, it said the way to a man's heart is through his stomach.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the food is a factor. And for one of the few times in my rabbinic career, I would like to actually use to quote the great Ben Bogbog, who, I mean, I've been waiting for like 38 years to do this, but, he said, turn it over and over and over again because everything is in it. So you need to look at everything from different perspectives. And kind of, as other people have said, she was part of a chevra, and she was seen as a part of a chevra. And all of a sudden, she's an independent, single woman. She's seeing, I think it's like he's seeing her brand new.
Yeah.
I'm convinced. All right. Good job.
Okay. Rabbi Schatz, do you want to tell your favorite Yichud story, and then we'll get into the topic?
Rabbi Pernick, why don't you continue telling us what the topic is, and then maybe I'll share my favorite Yichud story.
Okay. So we're talking about, so the topic is Yichud, and because a few people have been asked, what's the topic today? So, in looking at this prohibition of seclusion, of being alone with, someone who you're not married to, who is not an immediate relative. And the question Bonnie, I think, is like, is this a Torah prohibition? Is this a rabbinic prohibition? What's the story there? So actually, the origins of the prohibition of Yichud come from the story of Amnon and Tamar. If people remember that from the book of Samuel, which is actually a story of half siblings, King David's son and daughter from different mothers, where Amnon suddenly sort of develops this infatuation with his half sister and sets up a situation in which he's, pretending to be sick. He's in bed, and his friend tells him to do this. And, and his father, the king, says, what can we do to make things better? And he says, oh, I think if my sister came and gave me some food, then that would make it right back to the food. See, we stayed connected. So, it says, if my sister Tamar came and gave me some food, I think that would make me feel better. And so his sister, half sister Tamar comes and he says, oh, I need everyone else to leave. And so, just Tamar, you stay here. And she does, and he grabs her and she says, what are you doing? This is terrible. And basically he won't stop, and he ends up raping her. And then, the story as it goes on, he then, as soon as he, rapes her, then suddenly he despises her, and then her full brother Avshalom ends up killing him. Whatever, it's a disaster ending, with a lot of people ending up dead as a result. But the rabbis in the Gemara say, that story is the origin of this prohibition of Yichud, which is not a Torah prohibition. The Torah never says you can't be alone with someone. But the rabbis say, if this could happen to Tamar, who's the daughter of kings, and she wasn't being promiscuous or anything, right? She was modest. She was doing everything the right way. Again, she's a princess, all of that. And if this could happen to her sort of mourning after the fact, they say, based on her mourning, they say, if this can happen to her, this can happen to anybody. And so we need to set up a system to prevent that from happening, which is where the laws of Yichud come from, of being secluded. And from Tamar, we learn about being secluded with someone who's, unmarried but not a relative. Because if you just sort of derived it from the laws in the Torah, what we call the arayot, the forbidden sexual relations, that would be, an aunt and, sort of family members of different sorts. But they say from Tamar, they learn that it really applies to anyone who's, unmarried. So that's sort of the main theme that we're going to talk about today. Again, in Srugim, they're not machmir on Yichud ever. But in this episode, we really see some of the ramifications of that, of situations that arise really as a result of that seclusion, right? Avner would not have presumably done that in a public scene where someone could walk in, nor would Nati and Michal, I think is her name. Right, so there's sort of things that happen as a result of seclusion that probably would not have happened otherwise.
So Renee just asked a question just to me, but I assume that it was to be answered for everyone, given that it's not a personal question to me. She said, do you find that people who observe Yichud change how they observe it based on situations? So Rabbi Pernick, if you would like to speak to that. I can speak to my experience, but you could speak to like factual knowledge.
Sure, yeah. It's really
Let me preface where that came from. I saw a client once who was black hat, black robe, the whole 9 yards. And he was, interestingly enough, the only client that I've ever had to this day who, when he came into the office that I had at that time, closed the door and locked it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Seems to be the opposite of what he should have done. But
right. I mean, and I was, knowing obviously of the religiosity and Yichud, I was perfectly prepared to, when he came in, I left the door open because I figured that's what he would want to do.
I wonder if because it was in the I know what you do for a living, so I wonder if because it was in the context of that kind of experience, if it was because he knew that he was similar to like going to a doctor, right? He knew that he was getting an experience that in the world of Yichud might not have been seen as tznius, right, as modest, but that because it was helping him with what he was going through, right, that he was able to make like a separation. And though the locked door piece seems to be the opposite of what he should do, that potentially that allowed other people to not see that he was engaging in this kind of experience that he knew was one that was safe, quote, from any kind of romantic anything that would be happening, and was more of a consultation, right. And wouldn't allow people to see in as to make any judgments about it. I don't know. Rabbi Pernick might have more thoughts on that. That would just be my
that's what I thought. He just didn't want people to see that he had come in there. But I was mind blowing to me that, like I said, of all the people that I've ever seen, that dafka him.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a principle in Jewish law about how in situations where really the reason we prohibit is because of chashad, because of a concern that it'll look suspicious or that someone might do something wrong. That when it's sort of an established professional situation, we're not concerned about that. So by the way, one of the major places that this arises is when it comes to bread. That in theory, some people only eat pat Yisrael or pas Yisrael, bread that's cooked by a Jew. But then there's, as opposed to pas akum, non-Jews bread. But there's a leniency when it comes to what's called pat palter, which is baker's bread. And the reason is that, people assume, with non-Jews, they might be putting other things in their bread. Who knows, if it's not certified, it's a problem. But with a baker, we know a baker's not going to do anything untoward. They're not going to put in things other than what they say, because if they get found out, which eventually they would, it would destroy their business. And so in certain cases, we can be lenient because of the professional ramifications of a person doing what we would suspect them of would be so great. This, by the way, applies also to a taxi driver, that some of the concerns about Yichud in a car, about driving someone, and there's concern about being alone in a car with someone who, there's some room for leniency. Or Moshe Feinstein writes about, that you can be lenient if there's a situation in which it would sort of reflect poorly on you. But in general, it's better not to be alone in a car with someone who you wouldn't be secluded with. But for a taxi driver, it doesn't apply, because the same thing, it would destroy their business. They would, if they did anything, the word would get out and they would have no profession anymore. So that
taxi driver is who you're talking about.
The taxi driver.
Yeah, just to be clear, we're not talking about
the
We're not
car
talking
itself.
about someone getting into a taxi. We're talking about the driver not saying no to certain passengers.
Or vice versa. A woman doesn't need to say, oh, I can only be in a car with a female taxi driver. She can get in anyone's taxi, even though they're alone, because...
Or like Uber in today's
Or
day.
Uber, exactly. Same kind of thing. So so that, to Renee's point, that is a important distinction, that if it's sort of an established professional relationship, then we're not so concerned. I mean, there's still, in some cases, concerned, but that sort of eliminates one level of concern.
So can you speak a little bit, I know you did this before, but I think you did this before. Can you speak a little bit to the scenarios in which you would be more, not you, Josh Pernick, but you, the basis of halacha, would be more concerned with being in a car versus not, like in terms of side streets and traffic, and like, can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, one thing that I didn't see raised explicitly, but is sort of feel-wise is a difference, is like sitting in the front seat versus in the back seat, just in terms of ease of access, right? And I think the sort of the sense of the relationship, there's something about sitting in the back seat of a car that makes it feel like someone is driving you somewhere, as opposed to sitting in the front seat where there's a closeness. So there's a physical closeness, but there's also sort of almost emotional closeness, as it were. It was interesting back in the day when I interned in Montreal, Uber was not yet legal in Canada, but it existed. But when you called an Uber, you had to sit in the front seat, because if you sat in the back seat, people, you would be seen and spotted, and they would know that it was an Uber. But if you sit in the front seat, then it looks like they're picking up their friend. So that's a thing for a while in Montreal. I think now it's Uber. It's legal in Montreal, so that changed.
But a lot of the Ubers and taxis also have a mechitza now.
I said that too.
Yeah.
But
I mean, not really a mechitza, but it is physically a mechitza. They have that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, divider
between the back and the front.
Sort of for everyone's safety, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
you talk about like the route a little bit.
Yeah. So so Rav Moshe Feinstein talks about he has a tshuva. I can put it on the screen if you want. But he, I'll just share my screen a little bit. So he talks about different contemporary, not contemporary because he lived a little, he died a few decades ago. But he talks about, one of his topics is nesiya im isha b'mechonit, traveling with a woman in a car. And what he talks about there is, he says, there are situations, he says, look, lichatchila, like in an ideal case, it's better not to be, what?
You know that we can't see, and like we're looking at a very small piece of text.
Oh, sorry. I'll just do the English and translate it. I did a screenshot for the Hebrew because I didn't want to type it.
You can't read it though, so that wasn't.
Okay. So he talks about, lichatchila, like in an ideal case, it's better not to be alone in a car with someone whose Yichud is a problem for, because there's a concern. He says, even if you're going on a large public thoroughfare, even one in which people travel at night, look, there's a possibility of turning the car off of the public thoroughfare onto a small street. He says, even during the day, there's a potential problem, as, the driver could take the car far from the public thoroughfare to a place with lots of trees, where there's privacy, where they can engage in intercourse, where like there's, even in the day it's a problem, and at night even more so, right? Where the car, you could turn off the lights in the car and kind of have a lover's lane situation. But then he notes, in a time of need, and the examples he gives are, if a woman needs a ride to a place that her neighbor is going to anyway, right? So you're saying, I'm going to the supermarket. She says, oh, can I go with you? You're already going there. Someone saying, oh, I'm going to the same place. Can I catch a ride with you? So in that case, the destination's already set. It's not like, hey, I'm offering, right, in the Nazi case, he's offering to drive her totally out of his way to take her home. That's like a little bit more problematic versus I'm going to this location anyway. Why didn't you hop in?
It's like giving someone a ride to the airport, right? You're both going to the airport. So.
Exactly. You're both going. You're less worried about the deviation from the route because this person's going there for their own reasons anyway. And then
if there's no transportation, if there was no public transportation available, he didn't really have an option. other than offer to take her. I mean, it was either that or she'd spend the night. She can't walk home from there.
She could have taken the bus. It's just harder to take the bus off of, I think what they were implying was that, from what I know from family who are doctors, that after you've spent a 24-hour shift at the hospital, you're exhausted and you're also dealing with morning traffic. And so what she was saying was like, it's such a headache to have to take the bus early in the morning when all I want to do is get home. It's going to take me a lot longer. And so he says, let me just take you.
Right.
That's what was happening.
One thing that I would just like to add here is that I think there's a difference when both people are interested in each other and when there isn't that connection. So in the case with Yifat and the security guy, I forget his name, she was not interested in him. She didn't even think about it. It was like something totally off her radar because he was married and had 3 kids. Mm-hmm. In the case with Nati and the other, I guess she was another doctor or a nurse, he was not at all interested in her. She might have been interested in him, but he wasn't at all interested in her.
She seemed to be pretty interested in him. She was like giving him massages.
All right, but he wasn't at all interested in her. He put his ear pods in all the time, didn't want to listen to her, didn't respond to her kiss or anything. What is interesting is that no one's talking about the scooter ride with Ruti and that teacher who, and I think they were both kind of interested in each other. And that's a hell of a lot more intimate than being in a car. He had to have his arms around her waist.
So it's interesting you bring that up because I knew that this was a topic that Rabbi Pernick wanted to talk about. And so I watched the episode after he did. And I noticed that moment and he doesn't have his hands around her, which made me very nervous for him. He has his hands by his sides. You're right or I actually don't know if you're right. I'll ask Rabbi Pernick to answer. I don't know if that would be a case of Yichud because they're out in the open and he's not touching her, but you are right. At least I think you're right, that is a much closer proximity than if you were in an auditorium with someone of the opposite gender, and yet that is considered Yichud, but you're, a football field away from the person, and yet being on a scooter because you're outside and there are no walls, all of a sudden that's not Yichud. So it's interesting what those boundaries do to this halachic principle.
Right. And that's an interesting point. Again, like Rabbi Schatz is saying, there actually isn't a prohibition of Yichud with what happens on the scooter. They're out in public, anyone can see them. They're, so they're not in a secluded space. And again, a car is sort of seen as not by itself a secluded space unless you bring it to a secluded space. A car on the road is not considered a problem. On a thoroughfare isn't considered a problem. But as soon as you take it somewhere else, now it is a problem. But with Reut and Yochai, who are dating at this point, it's actually halakhically not a problem. They're very close to each other. Like it's sort of this, intimate kind of connection, but it's actually halakhically fine. Whereas, Avner and Yifat and so forth, like those are much more problematic because they're really alone.
There's a question in the chat that you should answer, but and I'm happy to give my own commentary. But I think that there's something, and you were the one who brought this up, that it's not just that Yichud is happening or not happening, it's the ramifications around if you're in a situation where Yichud is happening, right? And so what we saw in this episode was that the moments in which there was the moments in which there was Yichud, right? There are moments in which 2 people of the opposite gender were left alone together. There were moments of either sexual touch or some kind of romantic exchange, and that had there not been Yichud, right? Had there been other people around, potentially those things wouldn't have happened, right? The married man would not have touched Yifat's shoulder. It's possible that Amir wouldn't have asked to sleep over if the bus had been running later, who knows? But those moments of Yichud is what then leads to something else. And that, I think, is the most interesting part of this. It's not necessarily the Yichud, whether or not they are in Yichud or not, but the fact that there's something that comes out of them being in Yichud that might be seen as inappropriate. Yes? No?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to answer the question in the chat?
The one from Lisa?
Yeah.
Yichud is largely about perception. That's sort of the main piece. So a Jewish marriage, I shouldn't say Jewish marriage, a traditional, halachic marriage has three parts to it. It has kiddushin, it has, the betrothal, as it were. Nowadays it has chuppah, it has, standing under a symbolic house together, and then it has yichud. It has seclusion with that other person for 10 minutes or so. And at that point,
Chabad says 8 minutes.
Okay, Chabad says 8 minutes, so whatever. But, traditionally, what actually happened was it was essentially two parts. There was no chuppah. There was no 4 poles with people holding them in a talit over the top. The chuppah is representative of a house. Back in the day, you didn't go to a chuppah. You went to the house and you were secluded with the person, and that was the marriage. That was it. You did the Sheva Brachot. You did the 7 blessings. When you enter this house, right before you enter the house with this person, and then you're in the house and you're married. And the idea is that as soon as you're in yichud with someone, as soon as you're secluded with someone, we sort of assume that you're having sexual relations with them, halachically. And so it's sort of like, nowadays, we have the chuppah, but the chuppah is public, right? It's visible. So you need the yichud in addition, which is why, you actually need to go into the yichud room, because if you don't, we talk about consummating the marriage. It's not actually consummating. People very rarely have sex in the yichud room. Usually they eat food because they're about to not eat at the wedding.
That's why the timing is important, because you need to be able to tell the caterer. I seriously deal with this all the time. You have to be able to tell the caterer how long they have before they should bring food into the room, because that's when they're going to eat appetizers when everyone else is eating appetizers. This is one of the main questions I get about weddings. How long do we have to be in yichud before we get food? Anyway, continue.
No, but usually there's food in the yichud room.
But usually the caterer has to bring it in after a certain period of time, because I want people to be in yichud without a waiter coming in.
Right, so the food should be there beforehand.
Okay, anyway, continue.
Anyway, yeah. But either way, right, so there's sort of that assumption that if you're in yichud, you're having sex, and that's why with the way we do our marriages nowadays, which is not the way they were done historically, with the chuppah being symbolic, you still need yichud, because until you've been secluded with this person, it's like, okay, well, there's no possibility for you to be having sex, and so the marriage is sort of not complete. Again, you don't need to have had sex for the marriage to be complete, but you need to have had the opportunity to. And so, it's very much about sort of that perception, and when it comes to yichud, and that seclusion part is very important. So, that Lisa's point about perception is also is really important in a number of ways. I mentioned earlier on how in the Haredi world, adoption is very complicated, because an adopted child, it could be longer. There's a minimum amount of time. So and by the way, you have witnesses outside the door for the yichud also. That's one of the things you need to kosher witnesses. But going back to adoption, in our world, if you see a 12-year-old boy with, a 40-something-year-old woman, and she clearly seems to be in a maternal role there, no one's thinking, oh, they're having sex. It's oh, that's a parent-child relationship. And if they don't look similar, you might say, oh, that's an adopted parent-child. They're the parent and child, they're just adopted. But, in the Haredi world, that's actually often less so, and adoption is much more complicated once the child reaches the age of maturity, because suddenly they're like, oh no, yichud might be a problem. So because so much is about perception, I feel like for most of us, like there's no perception of impropriety. But in other contexts, people say, no, maybe we do actually have that concern, even with someone who you would say, like, there's no reason to suspect them.
I just want to, just because I am noticing the time, and I just want to share something as a person who, I guess, doesn't practice Yichud. So one of the things, I talked about this a little bit before, but there are certain ways in which you categorize people based on their denomination, right? So no one on this call, I don't think, would assume that I keep the laws of Yichud, because my movement is not a movement in which we keep the laws of Yichud. Now, we do for a marriage, but we don't before a marriage. Everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, most people know what Yichud is in terms of what happens after the chuppah. Not everybody knows that Yichud is a thing that also should be taking place beforehand. So one of the things, and I've spoken to Rabbi Pernick about this quite a bit, one of the things that I often wish is that there was an element of Yichud practice, just because I think that there is something there, even along the lines of what we were talking about last week with just boundaries, right? Having safe boundaries, having healthy boundaries, having respectful boundaries for people's space, I think is important and comes when you keep the laws of Yichud. But if you are a person who does not keep the laws of Yichud, and someone of the opposite gender comes into your office or comes to your home or whatever it is, and you don't have the kind of the rules in place as to how you keep that distance, that is often a difficult thing to try to draw a line in a nice way. So this is not the story that Rabbi Pernick wanted me to share, but when I was working up north, there was a time in which I found myself in a situation where I ended up in a room with another male, and nothing happened, and it wasn't inappropriate, but I would have felt more comfortable had the door not been closed. And that's not something that in my quote world is happening regularly, right? I think that is something that you would expect to have a door closed behind you if you're meeting with someone about something that's sensitive or a topic that they just want your advice on as opposed to being aired to the public. And so I just wanted to share that. I think that it's an interesting way that we think about how these laws also affect us in ways that we might not be interested in keeping them 100%, but that if there were elements of them in our lives, how that could be something that put a boundary in such a way that would make things feel actually safer or more boundaried, more kind of boundaried. I'm not going to.
So I just want to say that in 2020, there's all this focus on sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. So I know in my own personal experience with a rabbi that he never left the door closed when he was with a woman. Yeah. Because of claims of sexual harassment. He didn't want to be accused of anything.
Right.
So I would think you don't need the laws of Yichud to help you with that. You need a sensitivity to just boundaries between males and females in general. And we have them now because everybody's so sensitive about sexual harassment.
Well, it's kind of become good, practice, just general, good professional practice, aside from the halakhic aspect. I know the Friedmans have had their virtual hand raised for a while, and Norm, I see Jeff also. So we'll start. We'll go across on my screen. So I have the Friedmans first, and then Norm, and then Jeff.
I actually had an adoption question. I hope I'm not changing the topic here too much, but you were talking about how some people will, the problems that they have with adoption are because of Yichud. But I've heard that in some Orthodox circles that they would actually prefer to adopt a child who's not Jewish.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to worry about whether they're a mamzer or they're a Kohen and so on.
Yeah, no, yes, that is true. And also when it comes to the Yichud questions, it's sort of less problematic. There's fewer issues there. If, with the adoption, right, the child's converted, but they're sort of converted to this family. So there, for a number of reasons, there is a preference more in the Haredi world than the rest of the Jewish world, but there's a preference to adopt often sort of babies from areas that are historically Jewish areas for social reasons, so that they'll fit in, they'll look like everyone else, but who are not halakhically Jewish. So like, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, a lot of time, like there's a lot of adoption in the Haredi world from Eastern Europe of children, where, that's sort of seen as the ideal in some ways, is like someone who's not Jewish but could pass easily physically as Jewish, which of course is problematic, but that's often the way. You don't have to worry about whether they're a mamzer, you don't have to worry about whether they're related to anyone biologically, all those kinds of things, very much.
Norm has his hand up.
But how would that change the Yichud issue that you brought up?
So, the Yichud's not really, right, here we're talking about Yichud with a Jewish child two Jews. So I'm trying to think it through, because I know that there's the distinction there, and I'm trying to remember why that would be. And maybe it's not. Maybe the Yichud thing actually is a piece of it, because once the child converts, they're converted. They're Jewish. So it might be that the parents take on. Right, there's sort of someone needs to attest. Usually, like when we do a giyur katan, when you convert a child, there's sort of like somebody who's responsible for like taking charge of this child's Judaism. And so I'm thinking that if that's the parents who take that on, then in some way they become more halachically this child's parents than if the child was born Jewish. That's what I'm wondering. I don't remember exactly how, but that's what comes to mind. That like it almost might make, right, the same reason that when someone converts, their name becomes, Ben Abraham Visara, because it's sort of like you now are a new person with new parents. You're sort of starting fresh in a new way. So I'm thinking that might be a part of that it's sort of seen as a rebirth when you convert. Whereas if it's someone who's biologically Jewish, you're not reborn when you're adopted. That's what comes to mind.
Norm?
I have two questions. One is, I learned many years ago that if you didn't have witnesses to the fact that you had been alone, the two of you, who could testify that you had been alone and perhaps would testify that you had been seen alone, then you weren't going to be deemed to have been alone, regardless of, even if you'd been living together. And so that was an issue I wanted to raise that I learned from a rabbi more than 40 years ago. And the other question deals with if the place where they're going to have the Yichud room has even a small window, because I know a story about friendly acquaintances of mine who got married, and the bride had a particularly large dress that spread out a lot, and they were married in Westwood at a Sephardic synagogue, where it turned out the Yichud room had a little window way up at the top, and the rabbi who was marrying them decided this was not acceptable, and they had to find a room that wasn't like that, and they ended up shoving them into a broom closet where they could barely fit and were sort of leaning on each other, but they were able to close the door, and witnesses could verify they were in this room without windows all by themselves, even though they couldn't really even stand up, let alone sit down or do anything else, and they were stuck in there for whether it was 8 or 9 or 7 minutes, I don't know or care, but they described it as being just absolutely awful. But that qualified as their yichud at their wedding. And so I wish you'd address perhaps both of those issues, particularly the former one.
Do you want me to address it, or?
The former one? Sure. I can speak to the specific synagogue even that he's referring to, but yeah, you can do the former one.
Sure, I'm happy to take the former. So, right, this works in both directions. So, what I mean by that is, when it comes to a marriage, we need Yichud, and you have two witnesses who sort of hang out outside the room to sort of attest to the fact that they've been alone together. And we want them to be married, right? Married, the goal of a wedding is for them to end up married. So you need witnesses there, but it's sort of not, I'm not going to say not a big deal. It's important, but it's we're hoping that this wedding is completed correctly. On the opposite side, and I think, Norm, what you're touching on is, if we know that people were alone together, in a problematic case where they shouldn't be alone together, what do we do? And so basically the general practice is, right, when it comes to an affair, for example, it's hugely problematic halakhically for, let's say for a woman to, who's married, to then sleep with another man and then go back to her husband. You actually can't, halakhically. So it's a big problem. It's also a problem for the man to, sleep with a woman, especially if she's married, right? These are huge issues. And so, we said when there's seclusion, when there's yichud, we sort of assume that there's sex as well. So essentially, halakhically, what we do is we try to find any possible reason to get you out of those concerns, right? Even if the person says, yeah, we had sex together, we're like, maybe you misremember it. You say well, we lived together, maybe there was someone else who could see it. Or if the woman becomes pregnant, you have a problem. But other than that, this came up for people who were here with Shtisel. This came up in Shtisel where the guy goes and has an affair goes to Argentina and has an affair and all that. And the rabbi is like, did you see it with your own eyes? Didn't happen. And that's actually halakhically what we do. It's sort of if there's any possible way to say it didn't happen, then we say it didn't happen. But that's sort of to allow the couple to remain together if they want to remain together and so forth, because you have all kinds of a halakhic mess if there's, two witnesses who testify to the fact that they were together. And so, with the yichud room, there shouldn't be windows. If it's a window that really goes nowhere, no one can see it.
If I'm thinking of the particular shul that you're thinking of, this is where my aunt and uncle got married also. And I remember the yichud room because I was the one who brought in the appetizers. And it is, the window is not one, if I've never done a wedding there. If I were a rabbi doing a wedding there, I would not worry about this particular window. It's not a window that people can easily see into, nor is it a window easily accessible. I think that when there are windows in rooms, in yichud rooms, I've had, as Karen just said, as long as the drapes or the blinds or whatever can be shut so that no one can see in, if that's really the only space, which sometimes if you're having an outdoor wedding, there's really only one or two rooms to really go into, then that's fine, at least to my standards, that's fine. The issue is being able to see in, right? So the fact that you might be able to have some kind of public exposure, right, makes a place then not yichud, because yichud is this idea that you're alone together. So yes, if we're thinking of the same shul, then that window, to me at least, is not a problematic window. And they shouldn't have to be in a broom closet. That's ridiculous.
Right. A window by itself doesn't make it a problematic from a yichud perspective. It's only if it's a window that people can see into.
Correct. Yeah.
So yeah. Jeff, I know, had a hand up before.
No, I was just wondering. Speaking of windows, in the everyday world, in the business world or in the educational world, a lot of offices have windows.
Yeah.
So a teacher could call a person in, or a business person could have somebody in their office with the windows, with the blinds not being drawn. So would that be, would that be any issue at all?
No,
that's how you get around it.
Right. Just for professional practice, not halakhically, just good professional practice, we were told to ensure that the offices had windows. Yeah, Rabbi Schatz, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
No, I'm just saying that's something we were, told to make sure, that, if we had an office, that there was always a window or something, where, not for yichud reasons, for professional practice reasons.
Yeah. Bonnie, you've had your hand up for a very long time, but you have to unmute yourself first because I can't hear you. Wait, you have to unmute, Bonnie.
According to what you said earlier, the reason for the laws of Yichud are to prevent rape. What does the Torah and the rabbis say? What do they say about rape, and what are the punishments for rape?
That's a great question. It's not a one size fits all. There's different punishments and different things based on the situation. If you're raping for example, a married woman, then that's punishable, I believe, by death. I believe that's by death. So raping a woman, a single unmarried woman, that's sort of what we were talking about a little bit last week, where from the Torah, it's actually, the punishment isn't so severe. They say, you have to pay the father the bride price, essentially, and you can't ever, the husband can't divorce her. This is, again, if you just follow the Torah and not the Talmud, it's sort of like you pay the bride price to the father, and you can't divorce her of your own volition. The husband can't, because you sort of
you're married.
You took on this responsibility. And so it is what it is. That's part of what we were talking about last week with mikvah and so forth, was to sort of establish stronger restrictions, which would have stronger penalties to prevent, again, it can be consensual sex or rape, but to try to make instances of sex outside of those permissible contexts sort of more halakhically problematic, so people are less likely to do it. But it's not like all rape is punishable by death. It really depends on.
So essentially, if a man rapes a woman, an unmarried woman, it's not considered rape. He just has to pay.
Oh yeah, it is considered rape. It's just that there isn't, as opposed to there being, theoretically at least a death penalty for raping a married woman, there isn't that same, right? The punishment is different, but it is considered rape. And again, because the punishment.
I thought that he paid the bride price and they're married at that point.
Right, but because he raped her.
How is that rape?
Because he raped her, and so again, right, and the Talmud sort of tries to work around this because it doesn't like that being a viable way of marrying someone, but it's sort of assumed that it's better for a woman to be married because marriage is a form of protection in that world. And once a woman is raped in that world of the Torah, it's going to be really hard for her to get married because she's not a virgin anymore. So it's sort of like, you brought this problem about, so now you have to take responsibility for it on the man. Again, that's societally that changes, and so the Talmud sort of tries to work around that. But from the Torah's perspective, it's certainly considered rape. It's just that the question is, what do you do now? Like this happened. What happens now? And so how I see it, if a man rapes a woman, pays for her, and she's now married to him, that doesn't look like rape to me at that point. I don't think that the woman's feelings have been considered. It's like she's now his property. That I don't.
The problem, Bonnie, is that we're bringing this into a modern day context in which it can't be brought, right? Because what we're talking about is modern day
thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Modern day thinking, right? And when we think about what Rabbi Pernick is sharing, it's 100% not modern. And the way in which a woman was thought of was as needing a man to take care of her. And so if she was raped, which obviously was a terrible thing, but she would actually go down in status as a person for whom now finding a partner to take care of her would be much harder. And so the ideal way of taking care of that scenario was to actually partner her so that she had someone to take care of her. Again, none of this is good. I wouldn't say, and I don't think that's what Rabbi Pernick is saying. Rabbi Pernick isn't saying like this is how it should still be done, but what he's explaining is how it was once done and the way in which it was once understood. But of course, in today's world, if a woman was raped, we would never say in any, I don't believe, any denomination of Judaism would we say, okay, well, now you have to marry your rapist because that's the only way that you're going to find any consolation in having a male partner. So I think we just have to, there are some things in the Torah that we know of and that we teach that are difficult, and we teach them because they happened, but we try not to, put them together with real life experience, because as you are grappling with, rightfully so, it's hard to bring our understanding of these things back into the way that the Torah understood them.
Would it have been considered more of a sort of a prohibition or like a threat to mostly men? Like if you marry this woman, if you rape this woman, now you have to marry her. So it's less of a, would you consider it more of less consideration on her, much more of a, this is going to be your punishment if you do this?
I don't think that it was seen as a punishment. I think that if a man, I mean, even in today's world.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Sorry.
no, you can go.
No, I mean, I was going to say, I do think it was seen not as a punishment, but as a responsibility of like, you can't just, again, and this is consensual or non-consensual. The rules don't change whether it's consensual or non-consensual about sleeping with an unmarried woman. It's sort of like, okay, you did, like, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to have a fling or I'm going to do this thing and have there be no repercussions. It's like, now this is a life choice. And there's lifelong ramifications for what you did, right? So whether it's, punishment or whatever, like you can debate, and whether it's, again, it's certainly not an ideal outcome, certainly for the woman. But I do think to Terrell's point that there is something there about sort of saying to the man, like, you can't just pretend that this goes away. This is with you for the rest of your life.
I think
Father
Matt had his hand up.
Yeah.
You have two interesting situations in the Torah that I think relate to this. Near the end of Deuteronomy, Devarim, and Ki Teitzei, when a man acquires a woman prisoner, and the Torah is very clear, he wants to have her, but he really has to go through this period, and she has to go through this period of cutting her hair and her nails and wearing plain clothing and no makeup, and all this, and he's not allowed to even touch her. But then after 30 days, if he still has those feelings for her, which the Torah is basically trying to get rid of the testosterone and all of that, but if he still wants her, she doesn't really have a choice. I mean, he marries her and he's not allowed to divorce her. But the other one I was thinking of that relates, which is dealing with a Jewish woman, is with Dinah and Shechem, where, Dinah's brothers say that she was raped. But if you read the story, from what we can tell, she doesn't seem that unhappy, and Shechem wants to marry her. And of course, so look, clearly, I think all of us would agree that rape is a horrific crime, and it's a crime of violence, and as it was pointed out, power play and all that and more. But sometimes different people will use the term rape when that's not necessarily, or let's say that's subject to interpretation, as in, Breshit 34, where the brothers just feel, our Jewish sister is with this non-Jew, so he obviously raped her. And, when I read the story, it's like, she's glad, she sees them. She's not like, please take me away from here. Thank God you're here. It's, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Can I just add one other thing and I'll zip it? So many, many, many years ago, when I was doing bar and bat mitzvah tutoring, and my temple president came to me, and not exactly the window thing, but said, I don't want you doing any bar bat mitzvah tutoring unless there's another adult, in the next room or whatever, which, if one works a 9-to-5 schedule, then, presumably that can be done. But as I pointed out to my president, bar and bat mitzvah tutoring, like a rabbi schedule, is not 9 to 5. You're doing it kind of at all kinds of weird hours. I said, if you want to have somebody here at all those hours of the day, fine. But, I do have windows and all of that. So, again, there's the Talmudic world, but I think that's where we end up with all of this, that not everything fits so closely within set rules, because it's kind of like with Josh and myself. I don't know if this is a secret, Rabbi Schatz, so this may be another thing. So we've been participating in a fantasy baseball league for many, many years together.
Not a secret.
Not a secret. Okay, good. And there are all these Boston high-power attorneys who are part of this league. We have a constitution that I don't know how many pages it is, to cover every single contingency that possibly could occur in a baseball situation. And yet every single year we have several things that come up and it's like, that's, it's not in the Constitution. It's never happened. What do we do? So I'm just saying that you can make all the rules you want, but sometimes you kind of have to improvise.
Yes, Rabbi Barbara.
When I was in Beaumont, Texas, and it was probably after my first or second year, and they were renewing the temple's insurance policies. And it was also around the time that there was a lot beginning with the Catholic priests. And the insurance company put into the insurance agreement that I could not be in a private room when I was tutoring. That there had to be either the door open or a parent or someone present.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a still thing to today. I mean, I think,
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, it's a big. I mean, we make sure that students specifically, but also congregants, feel comfortable in our presence, no matter if they're of the same gender or opposite gender. I think we want to make sure that by closing a door, I always ask, when I used to work in an office, I always ask people, can I close the door? Or do you want the door closed? Sometimes I would say, because if they say no, then okay, fine, then we'll have the door open. But I never want to be in a situation in which someone can say, well, Rabbi Schatz closed the door during our meeting. So, that's not, there's a lot. And that was something that I think Rebecca, was it, who brought up just the ways in which our world has changed around this. And I think the one thing I'll say before Rabbi Pernick closes us out is that I see the sexual harassment piece as definitely an issue and something that we have worked on very well in, not perfectly, but we have worked on in society, and something that we're constantly dealing with. And I think that Yichud also is separate and apart from that, in which I would want to think that the laws of Yichud are keeping separation again, so that people can feel as though when it is appropriate to be together, that they can be together, whereas when it's not appropriate to be together, that you're not. So if you are in a room with someone of the opposite gender for whom it wouldn't be an appropriate thing for you to be seen together in a room behind a closed door, you shouldn't be. And if it is an appropriate thing, even if in my life, even if they are of the opposite gender, then I don't worry as much. But when it feels appropriate or not appropriate. And that's where I think my comment, based on not living a life in Yichud, right, that's where I sometimes reach out for those certain elements to bring in, less because of the sexual harassment piece and more so for the sanctity of being able to say, this is how I'm going to craft this moment or not, based on the person who I'm in that room with. So I think Rabbi Pernick is going to close things out for us, though I see the Friedmans have a question. So if it's a quick question, we'll take it, and then Rabbi Pernick will finish.
Yeah, let's take the Friedmans.
Okay, sorry. I had typed in the thing. So to remedy the man and woman not being together, is it ever acceptable that another woman can be there and have two women and a man? I know it's problematic.
That's always fine.
Because a woman, my cousin had said, well, you can't be the chaperone for me and my fiance because you're a woman and you're my first cousin, and you're eligible also. But okay, so there can be two women and a man.
Yeah, or a child. So, I mean, so this comes up. We try really hard to make sure that things are timed so that when a woman gets married, she's not in nida. Because if she's in nida, she's not allowed to be. And once they're married, the Yichud isn't a problem with the married couple, even if the woman's in nida. But until they're married, it is a problem. And so actually what we do. I mean, again, we try to make sure this doesn't happen. And, even in the Haredi world, people will use things like birth control pre-wedding to make sure they have things timed so that the woman can go to mikveh right before the wedding. But in a case where
when Rabbi Pernick says in Nida, he means literally on her period during her wedding, right?
Yeah.
Or during those days.
Within those days of, yeah.
I just want to be used.
Yes, the days of, correct, that where she can't go to mikveh because she's, still on her period. So and what they actually do in those cases is they'll have a child in the Yichud room and, have someone that, and things like that, and make sure that they're not in the apartment together and so forth, to make sure that they're not actually in Yichud until she can go to mikveh. So, so this, I forget what comment that made that arise for me, but
the idea
because Rebecca's comments about an extra person in the room. Yeah, so as long as there's someone else, and even if it's a child, as long as the child who's old enough to know what's going on, like vaguely to know what's going on, then Yichud doesn't apply. That was the reason why. We'll just close it out here. I mean, a lot of, obviously our conversation's sort of gone in a lot of different directions. And I do think it's important, I'm generally of the approach of like being don the cuffs to Jewish tradition, like assuming sort of good intentions and good, that things are there in our tradition for positive purposes. And I do feel like Yichud is very much one of those. A lot of the things we talked about like rape is really bad. It's really a terrible thing to happen. The story of Amnon and Tamar is sort of like, oh no, this is something we need to really be worried about. And so even though Yichud sometimes can be annoying, like there's real benefits to it, right? That's the whole sort of idea, is like, if you're not going to be alone with another person, then we don't have to worry about it. Now you might say men should be able to be alone with a woman without us worrying about them raping the woman. Like clearly that's
or doing anything with the woman.
Or doing anything, but like at the same time, to have that as a fence built in to say, if you're not alone with them, there's a very good chance nothing bad, nothing untoward is going to happen. And again, as Rabbi Schatz touched on, society has sort of developed in these, awareness around sexual harassment and so forth. But
that's what Mike Pence claims is his reason.
Right. So, right. Mike Pence claim, right, who will not have him, will not go to a restaurant alone with a woman, and so forth, which again, has its own problems as well in a professional place. But there is, I think, an importance as well to sort of ensure that nothing untoward happens. And I mean, as it's touched on in a few different ways, I think that those boundaries and there being clarity around those boundaries is important, because sometimes things change, and someone who we thought, there was nothing romantic going on, like with Amir and Yifat, suddenly that changes, the dynamics change. This is something that happens all the time. Or there was a misunderstanding, one person thought things were a certain way and the other didn't. All sorts of situations arise. Those are both things we see in this episode and are both things that happen in real life. And so there is, I think, a benefit, even for people who don't keep Yichud, of sort of having that clarity around boundaries and that consistency around them, to be able to sort of put those fences in place to avoid problematic things from it. So I think with that, we'll call it a night. Wish everyone.
Yeah, thanks for all sticking around. This was a much longer class than usual. And we will see you
next year.
Next
year.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.